Welcome to another episode of Costume Cinematographico. In my previous Q&A, I had a question from Nelly Tovinen, and I hope I'm saying that right, Nelly, about the costumes from different regions in the HBO series Game of Thrones. The question was so complicated that I thought I would do a dedicated video to try and break it down the best way I can. So in this part one of the Costumes of Westeros, we visit the various regions of the Seven Kingdoms and Beyond the Wall. And I have included many of the new costumes from Season 7. But like always, careful for any spoilers for the entire 6 seasons of Game of Thrones. Before we get to that, I want to share with you some submissions that I've received from some of my YouTube viewers. And if you would like to share your costume creations or cosplay images, and it doesn't have to be Game of Thrones, feel free to email me. I'll leave that in the description below. Viewer Aaron LaFay sent me these awesome pictures of his costume construction of a Cersei Lannister skirt. And he tells me that he's working on the bodice as well, which hopefully we'll get to see later. But for now, he's shared with me these 4 images. And if you want to know more about it, I've included his breakdown and description of his design in the description below. Meanwhile, Pikachu, as he's known on YouTube, sent me these amazing sketches of what he calls Sansa's Endgol costume. The one on the right is a watercolor version of the same design that's pictured on the left. And I think we can all acknowledge that at this point in the Game of Thrones, it's very possible for Sansa to be the one to take the Iron Throne. I'll put Pikachu's description of his designs in the description below, so please check it out. And I want to thank both Aaron and Pikachu for sharing these great and awesome pictures with me and with the audience. Essentially, the fantasy world of Game of Thrones takes place over 2 continents, Westeros and Essos, although there is a 3rd continent in the known world, Sothorios, which we have yet to see in the series. I have only read the first book, so I'm relying mostly on the series for this information, but feel free to fill in any bits that you think I might have missed in the comment section below. When creating the world of Game of Thrones, costume designer Michelle Clapton didn't rely solely on the costume descriptions that were provided by author George R.R. Martin, saying that they didn't really translate that well onto the screen. She says, "We were just trying to create a world that is incredibly gritty and real. They completely believe it, but you don't actually know quite where it is." When I first started, sort of decided to just research across the board. We just sort of immersed ourselves in museums and books and paintings and sorts of Persian and Inuit and Mongol, Japanese, everything. And then she goes on to say that the whole idea of this, I think, from the start was not to make it like a costume drama is like. It's not velvet dresses and pretty things all the time. When you watch it, you can really believe, you could believe that these are real people with foibles and that they sweat and they obviously, it's not doctored and it's not sanitized. Speaking of the source material, Michelle Clapton says, "The sigils were very important to us. We took the sigils but didn't stick closely to the description of the costumes." Despite being a fantasy world, the Game of Thrones universe is based upon our own earthly regions of Great Britain, Europe, and the Middle East. And apparently George R.R. Martin doesn't welcome this comparison, but I'm just using it to give you a bit of perspective. I'm providing this map for you just to show you that North America could also sub in for Westeros with its own north-south climate. So for instance, the 60th parallel might represent the wall, with Alaska and the Northern Territories representing north of the wall. The north itself might be Newfoundland and Labrador and northern Alberta. The Crown Lands might take place in sunny California, the Reach in the southern tip of the U.S., like Florida, and Dorne in the hot, dry climate of Mexico. I hope that gives you a good picture of what I mean. The continent of Westeros consists of 7 kingdoms in the area beyond the wall. Giving each region their own unique look was no easy task, and in her thinking about the overall design, Clapton says, "So, it was trying to pare it down so that each group of people had a look and a color and a way. And because it's not related to any particular time in history, there's really no starting place. Okay, it's medieval, but it is a fantasy. but there are so many medieval fantasies, really want to take this somewhere else and just explore a bit more. And so it was just to go away and to really try and think myself into the world and what was practical and necessary. Clapton's channeled her previous career, saying, "I sometimes see each city as a collection. I used to work in fashion many years ago. I'm glad I don't now, but it is, of course, an influence still." The North is by far the largest of the 7 kingdoms that includes the noble houses, Stark, Bolton, Reed, and Mormont. Show executive D.B. Weiss says, "It's a cold place. It's a place we're probably too cold for farming. It's very beautiful, harsh, rugged terrain like the northern parts of Scotland." And Michelle Clapton says, "The North became actually the most English medieval look. It's much blacker and darker." Clapton explains her choices in clothing the North, saying, "First, you have to think about what they need, the practicality of it, what materials they have readily available. We also decided we have no jewelry, so there's a lot of embroidery and embellishment in the women's clothing, as well as these lovely padded neck pieces. As for the men, most of the armor is leather, with some metal inside, but rarely close to the skin due to the cold. The fur collars were meant to be wolf pelts for adults, the children have rabbit, and the peasants have collars stuffed with sheep's wool." Winterfell is the seat of the ruler of the North and the traditional home of House Stark. According to Michelle Clapton, she says that the Starks have less available to them and are in different circumstances as they live in cold, damp weather. Available to them is wool, leather, fur, and some dyes. They have to think about warmth and wear the high padded embroidered collars as status rather than jewelry. The village people wear a simpler form of this look. They are not ostentatious and are a loving family who are not trying to prove anything. Only Sansa disagrees with this, and we see this as she is influenced in her clothing, mainly by Cersei, and as the plot develops, she moves away from this. Michelle Clapton goes on to say, "We have a lot of blues and grays, murkier colors that seemed right for the harsh northern climate. The Starks represent a warm family unit, so the blues of their costumes are rather warm. But within the family, the various personalities are reflected in what they wear. For example, Sansa is in a slightly cooler blue, and the design of the nobles' clothes spirals outward. What they wear inspires the people around them, from the ladies-in-waiting to the household staff, on down to the peasants." Here is a good shot of the Stark soldiers seen behind King Robert, and you'll notice that they're holding round shields that are embossed with the Stark direwolf, as well as swords and spears. The soldiers all wear what are called bascinets. It's a medieval open-faced helmet. However, you won't ever catch a principal actor wearing one because it might hide their face. Michelle Clapton says of this, "I mean, it's ridiculous and I know it and I fight it, but people wouldn't know who they were." Here's a shot from the show debut of young Arya wearing a helmet. Here's an example of a similar helmet. This one's a German bassinet made of steel and leather from about 1325, and it's on display at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. Poor Jon and Theon are required to stand behind the Stark family when greeting King Robert. Of Jon's initial look, Clapton says, "Jon Snow's look initially came from Winterfell, but because he's the bastard, his clothes aren't quite the same quality as his brothers and sisters." Ned was never seen adopting any of the clothing styles of King's Landing, Clapton says of the Stark family patriarch. He had 4 different looks, a couple of which were slightly smarter, but Ned generally chose to keep things functional and practical. So to that end, he'd often be seen in the padded linen skirts with the leather doublet, sometimes with a cape. Later in the season, as he began to sense trouble brewing, he started wearing his leather armor. Clapton adds that Ned Stark has an elegance to him, but he's incredibly practical. "I don't want him to look like he ever thinks about what he's wearing." And actor Sean Bean pretty much concurs regarding his portrayal of Ned Stark, saying of his costume, "What he wears, says something about who he is. So he's not prepared to be flouncing about like the others in gowns and silks and stuff like that." Here are 2 sketches by Michelle Clapton of Ned and Catelyn Stark. The notes on the costume design of Ned Stark read, "Wool cape with crossover leather straps center front for security when riding, etc. Leather trousers and boots, heavy padded undersleeves and skirt for warmth and protection, leather doublet, heavy oiled leather, and a fur pelt." And there were a few other notes, but unfortunately I couldn't read them. They're just done in very light pencil. Ned's undercoat looks like a gambeson, which is a padded defensive jacket. And you'll notice throughout this series that I'm going to mention it quite often because many of the Northerners wear these. And as well, the gambeson, it doubles as a winter coat for wearers, providing additional warmth. So Michelle Clapton says, "I used medieval Northern Europe as a starting point, but the skirts in the men's costumes have a Japanese look to them. We were never bound by the rules of any particular time period." As Clapton mentioned, Ned starts wearing Stark armor, a sturdy leather tabard with diagonal leather plates. In this flashback scene, young Ned wears the same armor, even though it's played by a different actor. And in this momentous scene in the episode Battle of the Bastards, we see Jon Snow wearing the identical armor to his uncle Ned, which, at one point we thought was his father, including the quilted gambeson and riveted gauntlets. And by the banners that we see in the background, you can see that the army of House Horwood, a vassal house in the north, they also wear gambesons and gorgets, which are the pieces that protect their throats. Robb also wears the same leather armor with the addition of some metal plate armor for additional protection. So he wears a gorget, which is the neck piece, and arm protection, and they include the parts, the pauldron, which is the shoulder part, the spalder, the couter, and the vambrace. In this screen grab, here is the Stark armor in the Game of Thrones wardrobe in a behind-the-scenes video from the HBO series for season 7. And I thought it was really funny that the armor is all on plastic hangers. I kind of like that. Here's Ned's brother, Benjen Stark, and he closely mirrors his brother's clothing, except that all of his clothes are dyed black because, of course, he is a brother of the Night's Watch. In this scene, Jon's clothes are very much like his uncle Benjen's, except that his garments are not yet dyed black. In this picture, the Stark boys wear leather and cloth gambesons and jerkins, which is a sort of medieval type vest. In this flashback scene when the boys are sparring, both Benjen and Ned wear quilted gambesons. Young Lyanna is dressed in boys' clothing similar to the styles of both of her brothers. Her clothing is suitable for things like archery and horseback riding, as you can see here. And perhaps her mother, which, by the story we don't know if she was alive at this point, wasn't in any particular hurry to dress her like a girl. In the background is a young Roderick Cassel in a leather jerkin. Here he is again, a little bit later. He's dressed in a close proximity to his younger self, except here he's wearing a very full-length cape with a fur pelt. Here we see young Hodor. He's dressed in a peasant-style clothing. Michelle Clapton says it was quite nice putting Sansa and Arya initially in very similar costumes. You have these sort of tied, knotted tops, and of course, Sansa's are knotted quite nicely with little embroidery bits at the end, and all very nice, while Arya's are just all messy and knotted and falling apart, and she takes the sleeves off. It's quite nice to have the two of them very similar, than to split apart so far away from each other. Here is a display of Arya and Sansa's costumes. In this promo shot seen here of Arya, she is wearing a peasant garb in a warmer climate. And while we can only speculate what her location is, we're pretty sure it's not Winterfell because obviously it's not winter. Her cape is a modified northern cloak, except that the cape is a very rough and distressed cloth with leather crossover straps, and her collar piece is suede instead of being a wolf pelt, which is the traditional Stark garb. And it looks like she's just basically put together this outfit with what materials she's been able to get access to. You've probably seen these promo shots from Entertainment Weekly and what their costumes tell us about the coming season, which is actually quite a lot. So the first thing is, we now know by this picture that all 4 Stark children have made it back to Winterfell. And why do I think that? Well, because of their clothing. Because obviously in the other picture of Arya, she is wearing a much more distressed costume. And when we last saw Bran, he was wearing also a very, very distressed costume. So both of them have brand new spanking costumes. The next thing is they're all wearing much warmer clothing, lined in furs, and ready now that winter is here. And Jon is wearing his armor under his cloak, which tells us that obviously he is in a threatened position, or he is getting prepared for war. Arya is wearing a version of Stark armor, which is interesting because she's becoming more like her father in a way to both maybe honor him and complete her mission. And so she's never been very girly anyway. So it just seems very suitable to her to be wearing this type of thing. Here's Michelle Clapton's rendering of her costume that I got from a screen grab from the recent promo. And with this cowl, I think that Bran's costume looks a little bit like an undistressed version of the Three-Eyed Raven. I mean, obviously it's new. While the lighting always makes it hard to know for sure, I don't think that the Starks are dressed in black. I think that Michelle Clapton, she's purposely kept black clothing exclusively for Cersei. So Sansa and Bran's costumes appear to be a mixture of charcoal gray and pewter, while Arya's costume, her brigandine and her boots are brown, her suede pants are tan, and her asymmetrical cloak is a mottled brown and gray. And meanwhile, Sansa's wolf pelt is cool, while Bran and Jon's pelts are warm. And in this shot, we get a really great look at Sansa's cloak. As viewer Pikachu pointed out to me on social media, it looks like the cloak fabric has a definite leaf impression, perhaps a weirwood leaf. In this shot, we see that Jon is wearing a metal plate gorget, which is again the neck protection, which is engraved with the Stark family sigil. And Sansa too has incorporated the sigil into her embroidered collar. If you look closely, you can see it's finished with 2 metal Stark direwolves. You have to look very closely though. Robb wears a similar Stark sigil clasp on his cloak at the Red Wedding. Here's a great on-set shot of Kit Harington dressed in his Jon Snow costume. The location suspected to be Dragonstone. So last season, Jon ditched the black, no longer being the Lord Commander of the Night's Watch. This season, his leather armor appears to be darker, almost black, but not quite black, while his foundation garment appears to be in the same taupey brown colors. While Sansa's cloak is very much Stark, I have mentioned before that I don't think her costumes look like her mother Catelyn's. And through this season, Sansa has moved from Winterfell to King's Landing to the Vale and back to Winterfell. She has picked up influences along the way, such as Stark, Tully, Lannister, Tyrell, and Arryn. Here is Michelle Clapton's rendering of Sansa's Season 7 costume. This costume is an example of an accumulation of all of her various looks. So the basic shape looks like a blend between her mother's gowns. There's a fitted bodice with an A-line skirt. The bodice is more doublet-like, similar to her father Ned's, but the wings on her shoulder look a little bit like Marjorie Tyrell. And the collar is Japanese in keeping with the Lannisters, and the padded collar on her neck is obviously a homage to her mother. The belt is a little bit of armor, and while leather, it reminds me of Cersei when she starts beginning to armor herself to make herself feel protected. And the rows of what might be black feathers in the front bodice look like the messenger raven feathers from her Dark Sansa look, and the pendant most definitely her needle. Michelle Clapton, though, she swapped out the moon door shape. You know, it's the circle with the line through it, and instead is using a silver circle shape. And if you look at pictures of Michelle Clapton, you'll see, and also the maester, you'll see that it's just like the ones that they're wearing. House Reed of Greywater Watch, the Gatekeepers of the North. It's a vassal house that holds fealty to House Stark of Winterfell. Howland Reed, seen here in a flashback scene, is the Lord of House Reed. And unlike Ned and his men, he is less protected from the dark Targaryen royal guard. He's just wearing a cloth gambeson and soft leather vest and a reptile leather collar and cuffs. In this close-up shot, you can see the lizard lion sigil buckle of House Reed. Howland Reed's children are Jojen and Mira, who are seen here, and they dress like the Crannog men, who inhabit the swamps of the Neck. And of their clothing, Michelle Clapton says, Jojen and Mira, their costumes have always been on the verge of being quite organic. Bear Island is the home of House Mormont, a vassal house that holds fealty to House Stark. We see very little of House Mormont, with the exception of a few notable characters, including Jorah Mormont, who is the former Lord Commander of the Night's Watch and former Lord of House Mormont before he was killed. And like all of his brothers of the Night's Watch, Jorah wears all black, although his clothes look distinctively northern, and his leather armor is covered in riveted steel plates. His son, of course, is Jorah Mormont, who wears a plate armor cuirass, which is the breastplate, pauldron, arm and wrist cuffs. And you can see his family sigil on his breastplate, which is the bear. Jorah's cousin is Lady Lyanna Mormont, sometimes also known as Little Bear. She is head of House Mormont, and she wears the same printed tunic and crisscross lacing detail that we see on Jorah. In this scene with Lyanna, we can see that the soldier sitting beside her wears nearly identical armor to Jorah. Here's the leather armor of the House Mormont archers during the Battle of the Bastards, and while it's softer than Jorah's armor, they also wear pauldrons, or the shoulder guards. House Glover of Deepwood Mont is a noble house from the Wolfswood in the north of Westeros. In the background, you can see the House Glover military costume, which consists of a cloth gambeson that's trimmed with scarlet and plate metal cuirass and pauldron worn on top. Robert Glover, Lord of House Glover, stands in front of a banner displaying his heraldry. Like Ned Stark, he sort of wears a leather doublet, which he covers with a cloth tunic and cape, and like other Northerners, keeps it in position with two cross leather straps. House Bolton of Dreadfort is an extinct noble house from the north. Lord Roose Bolton was the Lord of Dreadfort and House Bolton. And the Boltons' costumes are very similar to the Starks. It's an oiled brown leather jerkin over top of a quilted and padded gambeson. Both Ramsay and Roose wear their gorget armor piece under their jerkins, so not exposed, while the Bolton soldiers wear theirs on top. And like the Starks, Roose wears a full-length cape with a fur pelt collar, while Ramsay's is more like Theon Greyjoy's, as seen here. Both Roose and Walda wear the Bolton insignia on their leather cape cross straps, and despite their marriage, Walda continues to dress in Frey fashions, which I'll get to actually in the next video. Of Roose's bastard son, Michelle Clapton says, Ramsay's look does evolve. He tends to look more like a Bolton because he's finally acknowledged by his father, and there's obviously a step in that direction. He's proud to be the son. Roose's full-length cape, made from tiers of animal skin, was an early concept design intended for Ned Stark, as seen in this concept drawing by Michelle Clapton. The helmets worn by the Bolton archers, seen here during the Battle of the Bastards, are similar to this Morion cabeset, a type of open helmet. This Spanish helmet is from the Tudor period between 1520 to 1600. Meanwhile, the Bolton's elliptical shield dates back to the 11th century. And for all of you that stayed with me until the end of this slide, I found Michelle Clapton's weakness. It's belts. Here is a collage of the characters from across the continent of Westeros, all wearing their belts and sword belts buckled and knotted in an almost identical fashion. Not one belt loop to be seen. I did catch a few characters without the knot, but it was so rare that I thought it must have been a continuity error. So I hope you think that's fun. I hope you enjoyed part 1 in my series about the costumes of Westeros. Be sure to check out part 2, and if you enjoy learning about the costumes of Game of Thrones and the work of the talented Michelle Clapton, make sure to subscribe to my channel so you don't miss anything. And if you enjoyed this video, please like and share it with your friends. And as always, thank you so much for watching.